The deputy sheriff knocked at dawn with eviction papers. Across the street, my sister-in-law, Cynthia, was leaning against her brand-new Mercedes, laughing and drinking a latte. She yelled out, "Hurry up, old man! This house is ours now!" I did not argue. I did not scream. I just studied the papers in silence. Then I looked up and asked Deputy Collins a single question, and his face suddenly turned pale. He stepped back from my door and slowly turned his gaze toward Cynthia. But to understand how I legally destroyed her life in the next 10 minutes, you need to know how this nightmare started 3 months ago. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had a family member mistake your kindness for weakness. 3 months ago, my life was simple, quiet, and completely mine. I am Harrison Caldwell, though everyone just calls me Harry. I am 70 years old, a retired general contractor who spent 45 years breathing sawdust, pouring concrete, and building homes for other people across the state. My retirement was supposed to be peaceful. I had worked hard, saved every penny, and lived an honest life. It was a normal Tuesday afternoon when I walked down my long gravel driveway to check the mail. The autumn air was crisp and the neighborhood was quiet. I opened the metal mailbox and pulled out a stack of envelopes. Most of it was junk, a few flyers, a utility bill. But tucked in the middle was a thick, heavy envelope with the official seal of the county assessor office. I ran my thumb over the seal. My hands are rough, covered in thick calluses that never faded even after I retired. They are the hands of a man who earned his living through sweat and physical labor. I did not think much of the envelope at first. I assumed it was just a routine property tax update. I walked back up the driveway, stepped onto my front porch, and tore the envelope open. I pulled out a crisp white document titled Notice of Assessment. I reached into my shirt pocket, pulled out my reading glasses, and began to scan the page. The words did not make sense. My eyes jumped to a bolded section in the middle of the document. It referenced a newly issued $2.5 million commercial loan attached directly to my property parcel. $2.5 million. I stopped breathing for a second. I read the numbers again, thinking my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe the mail carrier put the wrong letter in my box. I checked the name and address at the top. Harrison Caldwell. My address. My parcel number. The document stated that the property was being reassessed due to a massive commercial encumbrance. A cold chill ran down my spine, the kind of absolute dread that tells you your reality is about to shatter. I walked inside and closed the front door behind me, clutching the paper so hard my knuckles turned white. I stood in the foyer and looked around the house. This was not just a piece of real estate to me. This was my entire life. I built this house with my own 2 hands from the foundation up. I framed the walls, I ran the copper pipes, I laid every single brick of the fireplace. My eyes drifted to the custom oak staircase sweeping up to the 2nd floor. I built that staircase in 1995 for my late wife, Martha. I spent weeks in my workshop meticulously sanding every single wooden spindle by hand just to see her smile. Martha loved that staircase. She used to wrap it in thick green pine garlands every single Christmas. I could almost hear her footsteps coming down those steps. Martha passed away 7 years ago, and this house was the only piece of her I had left. Every room held her memory. Every corner was a testament to the life we built together. We sacrificed for this place. I remembered the backaches, the 12-hour shifts, the weekends I spent taking on extra contracting jobs just to pay off the lumber and the materials. We did not take vacations. We did not buy fancy cars. We poured everything we had into this sanctuary. And the most important fact of all was that I had paid off the mortgage completely 15 years ago. I remembered the exact night. Martha and I opened a cheap bottle of champagne, sat in front of the brick fireplace I built, and tossed the final bank statement into the flames. We watched it burn, celebrating our total financial freedom. I had not owed a single dime to any bank for a decade and a half. The very concept of a $2.5 million commercial loan being attached to my home was not just impossible, it was physically nauseating. Someone had attached a massive corporate debt to the only thing I had left in this world. Panic began to claw at my chest. My first thought was identity theft. You see it on the news all the time, scammers stealing the titles of elderly people's homes, taking out massive loans and vanishing into thin air. I rushed into my home office, my hands shaking as I grabbed the telephone from the desk. I looked at the header on the assessment notice. The loan was issued by a major commercial bank in the city. I dialed the customer service number listed on the paper, listening to the agonizing electronic rings, navigating through the automated voice menus, until I finally reached a human representative in the commercial lending department. I gave the young man my name. I told him I was Harrison Caldwell. I gave him my address and my parcel number, and I demanded to know why there was a $2.5 million loan attached to my property. I told him it was a mistake, a clear case of fraud, and that I had not signed a single financial document in over 10 years. I could hear the rapid clicking of his keyboard on the other end of the line. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The longer he was quiet, the faster my heart hammered against my ribs. Finally, the representative cleared his throat. His tone had shifted from helpful to strictly professional and cold. He said, "I am very sorry, Mr. Caldwell, but I cannot discuss the details of this commercial account with you." I gripped the phone tighter, my voice rising in frustration. I told him, "What do you mean you cannot discuss it? It is my house. I am standing in it right now. I built it, and I have lived here for 40 years. The representative let out a quiet sigh, dropping a bomb that completely paralyzed me. He said, "According to the county records filed and verified 6 months ago, you are no longer listed as the legal owner of this property. The commercial loan was taken out by the current deed holder, and you are not authorized on the account." The phone slipped away from my ear. I was no longer the owner of my own home. My mind raced, trying to find any logical explanation. I immediately dialed the number for my younger brother, Richard. He is 65 years old and lives right across the street from me. Richard runs a small, struggling hardware store in town. He has always been terrible with money, but he is my brother, my blood. When he answered the phone, I quickly explained the terrifying call with the bank and the assessment notice. Instantly, Richard's tone changed. He sounded overly nervous. His voice got tight, and he started to stammer. "Oh, Harry," he said, letting out a forced, unnatural laugh. "Yeah, about that. It is just a clerical glitch." Richard began spinning a convoluted lie about an old joint business venture we had dissolved over 20 years ago. He claimed his wife Cynthia had her accountant looking into some tax restructuring, and the bank must have just crossed some wires and accidentally flagged my parcel. "Do not worry about it, Harry," he insisted, his voice trembling slightly. "Cynthia's guy is sorting it out. It is just a system error. I will handle it." We said our goodbyes and I hung up the phone. I wanted to believe him. I desperately wanted to trust my own brother. I walked over to the front window of my living room and looked across the street toward Richard's house. Just as I looked out, Richard's wife Cynthia was pulling into their driveway, but she was not driving her old dented sedan. Cynthia pulled up in a brand-new, gleaming black Mercedes-Benz SUV, a $90,000 luxury vehicle. My gut dropped like a stone. I knew for a fact that Richard's hardware store was 2 months behind on rent and facing eviction. The math simply did not add up. A sudden, chilling realization washed over me. This was no glitch. My own family was hiding something massive, and my home was right in the middle of it. I stepped away from the window, the image of that gleaming black Mercedes burning into my mind. My gut was screaming at me. Every instinct I had developed over 45 years of running construction crews and managing subcontractors was sounding a massive alarm. When you spend your life on job sites, You learn to spot a bad foundation before the walls even go up. You learn to recognize when a structural beam is rotting from the inside out, even if the drywall covering it looks perfectly pristine. Right now, the foundation of my family was cracking beneath my feet. I needed proof. I needed the one piece of paper that proved this house, this land, and everything on it belonged entirely to me. I turned away from the living room and walked swiftly down the hallway toward my home office. The hardwood floors creaked slightly under my boots, a familiar sound that usually brought me comfort, but today it just amplified the pounding in my chest. My office was a small, quiet room at the back of the house. I had built the mahogany bookshelves myself, carefully staining the wood to match the heavy executive desk Martha had bought for my 50th birthday. Tucked away in the corner of the room, hidden beneath a heavy wool rug, and bolted directly into the concrete foundation slab was my fireproof safe. I had installed it myself 20 years ago to protect our most important documents. Birth certificates. Martha's life insurance policy, my contracting licenses, and the original stamped property deed to the house. That deed was my shield. It was the physical manifestation of my life's work, proving that I owned this property free and clear of any debts, liens, or encumbrances. I pushed the heavy wooden chair away from the desk and knelt on the floor. My knees popped, a reminder of my 70 years and the physical toll of my career. I rolled the wool rug back, exposing the dark gray steel of the safe. The metal felt cold against my calloused fingertips. I took a deep, steadying breath, trying to calm the nervous tremor in my hands. I just needed to open the door, hold the physical deed in my hands, and prove to the bank and to myself that this was all just a massive, terrifying misunderstanding. I reached out to the digital keypad to enter my 6-digit PIN number. The code was simple, one I had used since the day I installed the heavy steel box. It was Martha's birth date combined with the year we got married. A number etched so deeply into my brain that I could type it in my sleep. I pressed the small rubber buttons, listening to the familiar electronic beep that accompanied each digit. I pressed the final number and waited for the satisfying heavy click of the internal locking mechanism disengaging. Instead, a harsh, high-pitched tone emitted from the speaker and a bright red light flashed rapidly across the top of the keypad. Error. I froze, staring at the blinking red light. My mind struggled to process what had just happened. I told myself that I was just panicked. My hands were shaking and my rough fingers must have slipped and hit the wrong key. It was a simple, stupid mistake caused by an old man letting his anxiety get the better of him. I wiped my sweating palms on the sides of my denim jeans and leaned closer to the safe. I took another deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I meticulously pressed each button, making absolutely sure my finger landed squarely on every single digit. I watched the numbers register on the small LCD screen. The code was perfectly correct. I hit the enter button. The same harsh, high-pitched tone pierced the quiet of my office. The red light flashed again, mocking me in the dim room. Error. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. A heavy fireproof digital safe does not simply forget a master code. It does not glitch. The locking mechanism on this specific model was entirely isolated from any external networks. The only possible way for my personal 6-digit PIN to be rejected was if someone had intentionally accessed the keypad, wiped the internal memory, and completely reset the digital combination to a new sequence. Someone had deliberately locked me out of my own vault. I grabbed the heavy steel handle and pulled with all my strength, hoping the locking bolts had somehow jammed open. The door did not yield a single millimeter. It was sealed shut, securing my property deed behind 2 inches of reinforced steel. Panic surged through my veins, but I quickly pushed it down. There was a backup plan. When I bought the safe, it came with a physical emergency override key, a long, intricate piece of brass designed to bypass the digital motherboard in case of a total battery failure. I had kept that key hidden in a hollowed-out cavity behind the bottom drawer of my mahogany desk. I scrambled over to the desk, pulled the heavy bottom drawer entirely out of its tracks and reached into the dark void. My fingers scraped against the rough wood, searching for the familiar shape of the brass key. The cavity was completely empty. My breath hitched in my throat. I swept my hand back and forth, tearing up splinters, but there was nothing there. And then a sickening memory hit me with the force of a freight train. 5 years ago, when Martha passed away, I was completely destroyed. I was a hollow shell of a man, barely able to feed myself, let alone manage a complex estate. During those dark, grieving months, my nephew Bradley stepped in to help. Bradley is Cynthia and Richard's son. He is 35 years old, a slick, fast-talking commercial real estate broker who wears expensive suits and always seems to have a confident smile plastered on his face. Back then, he played the role of the devoted, caring nephew perfectly. He came over every evening, brought me dinners, sorted through the endless stacks of medical bills, and offered to organize my financial documents so I would not have to stress about them. I trusted him implicitly. I trusted my blood. During one of those blurred, grief-stricken afternoons, I physically handed Bradley the emergency override key. I gave him permission to access the safe so he could retrieve Martha's life insurance policies and finalize the funeral arrangements. I never asked for the key back. It had remained in that hidden cavity, accessible to him whenever he visited. He was the only other person on the entire planet who knew about the safe, who knew about the override key, and who had free, unquestioned access to my home office whenever I invited my family over for Sunday dinners. The horrifying truth settled heavily in my stomach. My own family had orchestrated this. Bradley had used his access to my home, his trusted position as my helpful nephew, to secretly open the safe using the physical key. He had stolen my original property deed, wiped the digital memory of the keypad, and reset the combination so I could not verify that my most important documents were missing until it was far too late. I was standing in a house that my family was actively claiming I no longer owned, completely locked out of my own legal proof. The enemy was not some anonymous scammer operating out of a boiler room halfway across the world. The enemy was sitting in a $90,000 Mercedes across the street. The enemy was inside the gates. A sudden violent surge of adrenaline coursed through my body. My first instinct was to march straight out my front door, cross the asphalt, kick down Richard's front door, and demand answers. I wanted to scream at them, to grab my brother by his collar and force him to look me in the eye and explain how he could let his wife and son betray me like this. But 45 years of managing volatile construction sites taught me one crucial lesson about crisis management. You never confront a hostile force when you do not have the blueprints. Screaming would achieve nothing. If I confronted them now, they would just spin more lies, gaslight me further, and use my anger to paint me as an unstable, confused old man. I needed absolute, undeniable facts. I needed to see exactly what they had filed with the local government. I stood up, walked to the entryway, and grabbed my car keys from the brass hook. I walked out the door, ignoring the house across the street, and drove straight toward the county recorder office. Driving to the county building felt like navigating through thick mud. My mind was spinning with 100 worst-case scenarios, but my hands kept a steady grip on the steering wheel. I pulled into the crowded municipal parking lot, found a space near the back, and walked briskly toward the large concrete building. The air conditioning inside was turned up far too high, making the sterile fluorescent lighting feel even more oppressive. I took a paper ticket from the automated kiosk near the entrance. Number 84. I looked up at the digital display board above the teller windows. It was currently serving number 41. I found a hard plastic chair in the waiting area and sat down, surrounded by dozens of other people holding folders and looking bored. But I was not bored. I was terrified. The tension of bureaucracy is a unique kind of torture. It forces you to sit perfectly still while your entire world is completely collapsing inside your chest. I listened to the monotonous ticking of the wall clock and the dull hum of fluorescent lights. Every time the electronic chime echoed through the room to announce a new number, my heart gave a hard jolt. I watched the clerks slowly shuffling papers, completely oblivious to the fact that they held the keys to my livelihood in their filing cabinets. The wait took nearly 2 hours. By the time the digital board finally flashed number 84, my throat was completely dry. I stood up, my knees stiff from the uncomfortable chair, and walked over to window number 7. The clerk was a middle-aged woman, looking at her computer monitor with a weary expression. I gave her my name, address, and my parcel identification number. I told her I needed to see the most recent public records attached to my property, specifically anything regarding a change in the deed or any recent commercial liens. She typed the information into her system, her eyes darting across the screen. She frowned slightly, clicked the mouse a few times, and then looked back up at me with a perfectly neutral expression. She told me to wait, while she retrieved the hard copies from the printer. I stood at the counter, gripping the edge so tightly my fingers ached, waiting for the paper that would either prove my sanity or completely confirm my ultimate worst nightmare. The clerk returned a few moments later, holding a small stack of freshly printed papers securely fastened together with a heavy staple. She slid them across the laminate counter toward me, not making eye contact, already looking past my shoulder to the next number flashing on the digital board. I picked up the stack of papers. The pages felt warm from the laser printer. The document on top was prominently titled, "Quitclaim Deed," in bold, uncompromising black letters. My eyes frantically scanned down the page, skipping over the dense blocks of standard legal jargon until I found the specific lines detailing the transfer of ownership. According to the document in my hands, I, Harrison Caldwell, the grantor, had formally and legally transferred my entire $3.2 million real estate to a corporate entity listed as the grantee. The name of the receiving company was Apex Holdings, LLC. I stared at the name, the black ink blurring slightly as my vision swam. I had absolutely no idea what Apex Holdings was. I had never done business with a corporation by that name, and I had certainly never signed away the house I built for Martha to any commercial buyer. I forced my eyes to keep reading down the page, absorbing every terrifying detail of the transaction. The deed explicitly stated that I relinquished all rights, title, and interest in the real property, transferring full ownership and control to this unknown, faceless corporate entity. I looked at the bottom of the first page to check the official recording date. The document had been filed and stamped by the county recorder exactly 6 months ago. Half a year. For 6 entire months, I had been living in a house that legally belonged to a completely different entity, totally oblivious to the fact that my life's work had been ripped away from me. During those 6 months, I had mowed the lawn, repaired the gutters, and painted the trim, taking care of a property that I no longer owned. The sheer audacity of the theft made my stomach churn. The realization that this piece of paper was the exact document the bank had used to approve the massive $2.5 million commercial loan hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Someone had stolen my house and immediately mortgaged it for millions in cash. I could hardly believe it. I turned the heavy paper over, flipping to the second page where the final execution of the transfer was formally documented. I needed to see who had signed the document, fully expecting to find a crude, amateurish fake, or perhaps a completely different name acting as a fraudulent proxy. Instead, my eyes locked onto the signature line at the bottom right corner of the page. It was my signature. Harrison Caldwell, signed in blue ink. It was not a sloppy forgery. The looping capital H, the sharp angles of the double letters, the distinctive long tail on the final D. It was an absolute picture-perfect replica of the way I had signed my name for the last 50 years. Whoever had executed this document had not just traced my handwriting, they had practiced it relentlessly until it flowed with the natural, confident pressure of my own hand. It was chilling to look at a piece of paper and see my own identity weaponized against me with such terrifying precision. I traced my finger over the blue ink, feeling a deep rising anger replacing the initial wave of panic. But a forged signature alone was not enough to execute a legal property transfer. A deed requires authentication. My eyes drifted downward, moving just below the signature line to a raised circular indentation pressed firmly into the paper. It was the official raised seal of a registered notary public, accompanied by a stamped signature verifying that I had personally appeared before the notary, provided valid government identification, and signed the document of my own free will. The notary stamp belonged to someone named Jonathan Miller, a name I did not recognize at all. I stared at the notary section, my mind racing to figure out how they had pulled this off. A crooked notary was the only explanation. Someone had been bribed to validate the forged signature. And then I saw the date. The date was stamped clearly in black ink right next to the notary seal, formally recording the exact day the transaction had been executed. October 14th. The date hit me like a splash of ice water. October 14th. I closed my eyes, letting the memory of that specific day rush back into my mind. The pieces of the puzzle began to snap together, forming a picture so vile and so deeply calculated that it took my breath away. On October 14th, I was not sitting in a notary office signing away my estate. On the afternoon of October 13th, I suffered a mild heart attack while working in my garden. My brother Richard had driven me to St. Jude Hospital. By the morning of October 14th, I was lying in an intensive care unit bed, hooked up to a dozen different cardiac monitors. I was heavily medicated with strong painkillers and blood thinners. I spent that entire day drifting in and out of a chemically induced sleep. I was physically and mentally incapable of holding a pen, let alone executing a multi-million-dollar real estate transfer in front of a licensed government official. The people who orchestrated this did not just forge my signature. They meticulously planned the execution of this document on the exact day I was fighting for my life in a hospital bed, knowing I would have zero alibi and absolutely no memory of those 24 hours. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a blatant, calculated felony forgery committed by someone who knew my exact medical schedule. My family knew I was in the hospital. My nephew Bradley was the one who went to my house to feed my dog while I was recovering. That was when he accessed the safe. The timeline was completely undeniable. I folded the heavy quitclaim deed and stared blindly at the floor of the county clerk office. I knew my brother and nephew were involved, but the deed was transferred to a corporate entity. The missing piece of the puzzle was the final destination of my life savings. I needed to know exactly who was secretly running this shell company. I walked back to the counter. I needed to find out who actually owns Apex Holdings. I stepped back up to the laminate counter, my boots feeling heavier than they had just minutes prior. I caught the attention of the same weary clerk who had handed me the forged quitclaim deed. I told her I needed to pull the state incorporation documents for the corporate entity listed on the deed, Apex Holdings LLC. She let out a long, exaggerated sigh, clearly annoyed by the extra work, and informed me that corporate filings required a separate search and a $50 processing fee. I reached into my worn leather wallet, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, and slid it across the counter without a single moment of hesitation. I would have paid $5,000 right then and there to find out exactly who was hiding behind that corporate shield. The clerk took the money, typed the name of the limited liability company into her state database portal, and hit print. The machine hummed to life once again. As I waited, my mind churned through the mechanics of real estate fraud. I had spent 45 years in the construction business, and I knew exactly how these shell companies operated. Crooks use them to build an invisible wall between their stolen assets and their real identities. They hide behind registered agents and post office boxes, moving money through corporate accounts to wash it clean before anyone even realizes a crime has been committed. I knew whoever was running this company had orchestrated the theft of my life savings. The clerk handed me a fresh stack of papers, the official articles of organization filed with the Secretary of State. I took the documents and walked over to a quiet corner of the lobby, leaning against a cool marble pillar. I flipped past the standard cover sheets and the generic operating agreements, my eyes scanning the dense text for the only information that actually mattered. I was looking for the section titled Initial Members and Managing Directors. I needed a name. I needed a face to attach to this monstrous betrayal. I ran my calloused index finger down the page line by line, navigating through the complex legal jargon until I found the official registry of the corporate officers. And there, printed in stark black ink, was the name of the sole managing director of Apex Holdings, LLC. The name printed on the official state registry was Cynthia Caldwell, my sister-in-law, the very same woman who just a few hours ago had pulled into her driveway across the street in a brand new $90,000 luxury vehicle. The woman who smiled at me at family dinners, who hugged me at my wife's funeral, and who played the role of the caring relative while secretly plunging a knife directly into my back. I stared at her name until the letters began to blur together. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it was staggering. She did not just steal the house I built with my own two hands. She had immediately weaponized it. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with sickening clarity. Cynthia had forged my signature while I was fighting for my life in a hospital bed, transferred the legal deed of my $3.2 million estate into her newly created shell company, and then marched straight into a commercial bank. She presented the stolen property as collateral to secure a massive $2.5 million cash loan. That was where the money for her new car came from. That was how she was funding her suddenly lavish lifestyle while her husband ran a failing business. She was spending the equity of my life savings, draining the value of my home to fund her own greed. And Richard, my own brother, was absolutely complicit. There was no way Cynthia could orchestrate a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme and suddenly come into millions of dollars in cash without her husband knowing exactly where the money was coming from. Richard's nervous, stuttering voice on the phone earlier made perfect sense now. He was not confused about a clerical glitch. He was terrified that I had finally discovered their massive criminal conspiracy. They had looked at a grieving 70-year-old man and saw nothing but an easy target, a piggy bank they could drain, while I quietly faded away into the background. My blood boiled, a hot white rage radiating from my chest down to my fingertips, but I forced myself to remain perfectly still. Anger is a useless emotion if it is not channeled into absolute calculated destruction. I needed to know exactly what her endgame was. She had the cash, but she still had the physical house. I flipped through the remaining pages of the file the clerk had given me, digging deeper into the thick stack of attachments connected to the bank lien. There had to be more. $2.5 million was a massive loan, but the estate was worth over $3 million. Cynthia was a greedy woman, and greedy people never leave money on the table. Near the back of the packet, tucked behind the amortization schedules and the title insurance policies, I found a secondary legal document. It was a formal pending sale agreement. I read through the contractual terms, my heart sinking lower with every single sentence. Cynthia was not just keeping the house to leverage the bank loan. She was actively selling the entire property to a corporate entity known as Sterling and Vanguard Commercial Developments. The contract outlined a massive multi-million-dollar buyout contingent on the property being delivered completely vacant and cleared of all current occupants. I knew exactly who Sterling and Vanguard were. Any contractor in this county knew their reputation. They were a ruthless development firm, notorious for buying up large residential plots, flattening the existing structures, and paving over the land to build high-density luxury condominiums. They did not care about the history of a home. They only cared about the square footage of the dirt it sat on. Cynthia was selling the house I built for Martha to a company that was going to bring in heavy machinery and bulldoze it into dust. They were going to smash the custom oak staircase, tear down the brick fireplace, and erase every single memory I had left of my wife. It was not just a financial theft. It was the complete callous erasure of my entire life's work. Cynthia was willing to destroy my sanctuary, pave over the garden Martha had planted with her own hands, and leave me homeless on the street, all to pocket a massive corporate payout. The depth of her depravity was truly bottomless. I carefully folded the documents, making sure the creases were sharp and perfectly aligned. I slid the papers into the inside pocket of my denim jacket, placing them right against my chest. I had the blueprints of their betrayal. I knew the players, I knew the stakes, and I knew the timeline. Now it was time to go home. The drive back to my neighborhood was a blur of righteous fury and cold calculation. My blood was absolutely boiling, a fiery current rushing through my veins, but I forced my facial muscles into a mask of total, unbothered calm. I could not afford to let them see my anger. If I confronted them now, if I screamed or threatened police action, they would panic, hire expensive defense lawyers with my stolen money, and tie me up in civil litigation for the rest of my natural life. I had to play the long game. I had to let them believe they were winning until the exact moment I snapped the trap shut. I turned onto my street, the familiar tree-lined road that I had driven down thousands of times. I approached my property, slowing my truck, as the large, sprawling lawn came into view. As I pulled into my long gravel driveway, I saw a sleek, late-model sedan parked illegally near my front garden. Standing right in the middle of my perfectly manicured front lawn was my nephew, Bradley. He was wearing a sharp, tailored navy blue suit, his polished dress shoes sinking slightly into the soft grass. He was holding a sleek silver iPad up to his face, slowly panning the device back and forth to capture wide-angle photographs of my home's exterior architecture. He was framing the shot, documenting the dimensions of the property, completely oblivious to my arrival. The invasion had already begun. They were not even waiting for me to leave. They were actively preparing my home for the corporate bulldozers right in front of my face. I put the truck in park, killed the engine, and took one final deep breath. It was time to put on the performance of a lifetime. I opened the heavy metal door of my truck and stepped out onto the gravel. The crunching sound beneath my work boots immediately drew Bradley's attention. He lowered his sleek silver tablet and turned toward me, flashing that practiced $1 million smile he used to charm his wealthy real estate clients. "Uncle Harry," he called out, his voice practically dripping with fake affection. He casually strolled across the lawn, not a single hint of guilt or hesitation in his eyes. "I hope you do not mind me dropping by unannounced. I just got this new tablet, and I wanted to test out the camera quality. Your house has such fantastic lines and natural light, I figured it was the perfect place to practice some architectural photography." I stood there looking at the man who had secretly unlocked my safe, stolen my property deed, and sold my future to a corporate demolition crew. Every muscle in my body begged me to grab him by the lapels of his expensive navy blue suit and throw him off my property. I wanted to shatter his expensive tablet into 1,000 pieces and demand to know how much his mother paid him to betray his own blood. But I swallowed the burning rage rising in my throat. I forced my shoulders to slump slightly, letting my posture mirror the heavy weight of my 70 years. I relaxed my facial features, replacing my intense glare with a vacant, slightly confused expression. I had to become exactly what they thought I was. A tired, clueless, senile old man who was completely oblivious to the world shifting around him. "Oh, Bradley," I said, making my voice sound a bit raspy and weak. "It is just you. You startled me for a second. My vision is not quite what it used to be these days. Go right ahead and take all the pictures you want. The front garden could use some serious pruning, but Martha always loved the way the afternoon sun hit the porch." I rubbed my forehead, acting as though the simple interaction was physically draining. Bradley nodded clearly, buying the act hook, line, and sinker. His smile widened completely, convinced that his fragile old uncle suspected absolutely nothing. It was sickening to watch him revel in his own perceived cleverness, but it was exactly the opening I needed. I gestured toward the front door with a slow, trembling hand. I told him it was getting a bit chilly out on the lawn, and asked if he wanted to come inside for a warm cup of coffee. I added that it gets awfully lonely in this big, empty house all by myself, playing up the pathetic widower routine just enough to stroke his ego. Bradley checked the silver watch on his wrist and gave a dismissive shrug, saying he had a few minutes to spare. I turned my back to him and slowly climbed the wooden steps to the front porch, making sure to lean heavily on the handrail. As soon as I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer, I knew I had to act quickly. I guided him toward the living room and told him to make himself comfortable on the sofa while I went into the kitchen to start the coffee pot. He immediately dropped onto the plush cushions and began tapping away on his tablet, completely ignoring me. The moment I was out of his line of sight, my frail demeanor vanished. I stood perfectly still in the kitchen, my mind razor sharp. I reached into my denim jacket and pulled out my smartphone. I swiped the screen to unlock it, opened the voice memo application, and pressed the bright red record button. The screen indicated it was actively capturing audio. I carefully slipped the phone into the top breast pocket of my flannel shirt, making sure the microphone was exposed just enough to pick up our conversation clearly. I needed him to talk. I needed him to say something arrogant, something incriminating, that I could use when the time was right. I poured 2 mugs of dark roast coffee intentionally, letting my hand shake a little so a few drops spilled onto the saucer. I carried the mugs back into the living room, setting them down on the oak coffee table with a loud clatter. Bradley barely looked up from his screen. He took a sip of the hot liquid and leaned back, surveying the room with a calculating gaze. He was not looking at the memories hanging on the walls or the craftsmanship of the molding. He was looking at the square footage, mentally calculating the demolition costs and the profit margins for his corporate buyers. I eased myself into the armchair opposite him, letting out a long, weary sigh. I told him my joints were aching more than usual lately, and that keeping up with the property maintenance was starting to feel like an impossible mountain to climb. I complained about the gutters needing to be cleaned, the lawn needing to be mowed, and the drafty windows in the upstairs bedrooms. Every word I spoke was a carefully calculated piece of bait designed to feed his narrative that I was a broken-down man ready to surrender my independence. I leaned my head back against the chair and closed my eyes, acting completely overwhelmed by the daily burdens of life. Bradley took the bait without a single second of hesitation. He set his coffee mug down on the coaster and leaned forward, clasping his hands together in a gesture of fake sympathy. His tone shifted into the smooth, practiced cadence of a real estate broker trying to close a difficult deal. He looked around the spacious living room and sighed. "You know, Uncle Harry," he began, keeping his voice light and deceptively casual, "have you ever seriously thought about moving to a nice retirement condo? This place is just getting way too big for you anyway. You are getting older and you really need to relax. You should not be spending your golden years worrying about leaky roofs and yard work." I kept my eyes closed for a moment, letting the sheer audacity of his words wash over me. The man sitting in my living room drinking my coffee had already finalized the secret sale of this exact house to a corporate developer. He was sitting there pretending to care about my personal comfort while actively plotting my impending eviction. It was a major slip-up born out of pure arrogance. He was trying to plant the seed of moving out, so that when the sudden eviction notice inevitably arrived, he could pretend it was a blessing in disguise. I opened my eyes and gave him a weak, appreciative nod. I told him that maybe he was right, that maybe it was time for me to finally let go and move on to something smaller. He smiled, completely satisfied with his manipulation, unaware that my phone was quietly recording every single treacherous word he spoke. After a few more minutes of hollow pleasantries, Bradley checked his watch again and announced he had a very important client meeting to attend. I walked him to the front door, maintaining my fragile persona, and wished him a wonderful afternoon. I stood on the porch and watched as he walked down the driveway, not toward the sedan I had initially seen, but toward a sleek black corporate SUV parked further down the street. It was a high-end model, with deeply tinted windows, the kind of vehicle used by executives who wanted to remain unseen. He opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and drove away without looking back. The moment his taillights disappeared around the corner, my posture straightened. The tired, senile old man vanished instantly. I pulled a small notepad and a pen from my pocket and quickly jotted down the license plate number I had memorized as he pulled away. I walked back into my home office, locked the door, and sat down at my computer. Over my years in construction, I had acquired several database subscriptions to run background checks on shady subcontractors. I logged into the portal, typed in the license plate digits, and hit search. The results populated on the screen in a matter of seconds. My blood ran cold as I read the vehicle registration details. The sleek black SUV was not registered to Bradley or his real estate agency. It was officially registered to Sterling and Vanguard, the exact ruthless commercial development firm listed on the pending sale agreement. The corporate vultures were not just buying my property. They were providing my nephew with a company car to facilitate the theft of my home. I sat frozen in my desk chair, the glow of the computer monitor casting long shadows across my home office. The vehicle registration details on the screen confirmed my darkest suspicions. The sleek black SUV belonged to Sterling and Vanguard, the very same commercial development firm listed on the pending sale agreement I had uncovered at the county clerk office. Bradley was not just driving a company car. He was deeply embedded in their corporate machinery. The pieces of the puzzle shifted, forming a picture so vile it made my stomach churn. My nephew was not just an innocent bystander or a passive participant in his mother's fraudulent scheme. He was the architect of the sale. The photographs he had been taking on my front lawn with his expensive silver tablet were not for his personal architectural portfolio. They were site surveys. He was documenting the property lines, assessing the demolition requirements, and packaging my home into a neat, profitable portfolio for his corporate bosses. He was acting as the commercial real estate broker for the stolen property. It was a staggering level of betrayal. Bradley had sat in my living room, drank the coffee I poured for him, and pretended to care about my aching joints, all while actively finalizing the logistics of my impending eviction. He had used the trust I placed in him after Martha died to steal the key to my safe, paving the way for his mother to forge the deed. And now he was managing the final disposition of the asset. He was the bridge between Cynthia's felony forgery and the corporate bulldozers waiting to flatten my life's work. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. He felt so untouchable, so confident in my perceived senility, that he did not even bother to hide his corporate vehicle. He parked it right on my street, assuming I was too blind and too foolish to notice. I closed the database portal and leaned back in my chair. The anger inside me solidified, hardening from a fiery rage into a cold, impenetrable block of ice. I needed to see exactly how much blood money my own nephew stood to make from my destruction. I needed to uncover the hidden financial mechanics of his profound betrayal. I had to see the exact numbers printed in black and white. Over my 45 years as a general contractor, I had built a vast network of professional relationships. I knew plumbers, electricians, city planners, and plenty of real estate agents. I picked up my phone and called an old friend named David, a veteran broker who owed me a few favors from a massive commercial build-out we collaborated on a decade ago. I did not give him the specifics of my situation. I simply told him I needed temporary access to the back end of the multiple listing service database to check on some off-market commercial zoning data. David did not ask any questions. Within 5 minutes, he texted me a temporary login credential and a secure password. I opened a new browser window, navigated to the strictly restricted real estate portal, and entered the login information. The complex database loaded on my screen. I bypassed the public residential listings and dove straight into the hidden off-market commercial transactions. I typed in my property address and hit the search key. A highly restricted file instantly populated on the screen. It was an active private listing categorized under land acquisition and commercial redevelopment. I clicked on the digital file, opening the full contractual breakdown. There it was, laid out in sterile, uncompromising corporate data. The seller was listed as Apex Holdings, representing Cynthia. The buyer was officially listed as Sterling and Vanguard. But it was the broker representation section that made my jaw clench. Bradley was listed as the sole facilitating agent for the entire acquisition. I scrolled down to the compensation schedule, my eyes scanning the percentages and escrow instructions. According to the internal document, Bradley had successfully negotiated a massive non-negotiable broker commission for delivering the property off-market. The figure was clearly highlighted in the breakdown: $150,000. That was the exact price of his loyalty. For $150,000, my nephew was willing to orchestrate the total destruction of my home and leave me destitute. The contract specifically stated that this massive commission would be released from the corporate escrow account and wired directly into his personal banking account the exact moment the demolition permits were activated and the heavy bulldozers arrived on the property. He was literally cashing in on my complete and total destruction. I continued to scroll through the dense digital pages of the commercial sale agreement, my eyes searching for the operational timeline. A development firm like Sterling and Vanguard did not just buy property and let it sit idle. They operated on strict corporate schedules heavily tied to massive construction loans and municipal zoning permits. They needed immediate access to begin their demolition process. I found the section labeled Transfer of Possession and Closing Contingencies. My heart hammered a heavy rhythmic beat against my ribs as I read the specific clauses Cynthia and Bradley had formally agreed to. The contract stipulated a hard, unyielding deadline. Apex Holdings was legally bound to deliver the entire property to the buyers in a condition classified as completely vacant and clear of all physical occupants, liens, and structural hazards. There were no extensions allowed, and there was no grace period built into the transaction. I looked at the bolded date indicating the final closing deadline. I glanced down at the digital clock on my computer taskbar and did the mental math. They needed me out of this house in exactly 14 days. 14 days. That was the entire span of my remaining timeline. In 2 short weeks, they were planning to enact some sort of sudden, forceful maneuver to physically remove me from the only home I had known for 4 decades. I realized then why Bradley had been so eager to plant the seed about me moving into a nice retirement condo during our coffee chat. He was laying the preliminary psychological groundwork. They were probably going to manufacture a fake emergency, or perhaps present a fraudulent legal notice to rush me out the door under the guise of family assistance. If I had not checked the mail today, if I had simply thrown that county assessment notice into the recycling bin, I would have been completely blindsided. I would have woken up in 2 weeks to find bulldozers idling at the end of my gravel driveway, and a sheriff deputy knocking on my door with an active eviction notice. The sheer velocity of their scheme was terrifying. They had quietly lined up the financing secured, the buyer forged the legal documents, and set the final demolition schedule without making a single sound. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable tight corner, leaving me absolutely no time to mount a proper legal defense. But they were profoundly wrong. I had 14 days to completely dismantle their entire lives. I closed the database and sat in the quiet of my office. The logical next step for any normal person would be to pick up the telephone, dial 911, and report the felony forgery directly to the local police. But I knew exactly how that scenario would play out. If I went to the police right now, Cynthia would immediately hire a high-priced defense attorney using the $2.5 million she had already stolen from my home equity. Her lawyer would spin a convoluted story about a family misunderstanding, claiming I had given verbal consent and simply forgot due to my advanced age. The prosecutor, overwhelmed with violent crimes, would eventually offer her a comfortable plea deal. She would probably get probation pay, a small fine, and walk away with a slap on the wrist, while my property remained tangled in years of agonizing civil litigation. That was simply not good enough. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I did not just want to stop the sale. I wanted them to feel the exact same terror they had planned for me. I wanted them completely destroyed. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a heavy embossed business card. It belonged to Thomas Gallagher, the most ruthless, aggressive real estate litigation attorney in the state. Thomas was a shark in a tailored suit, a man known for bankrupting his opponents before a case even reached a courtroom. I picked up my phone and dialed his direct number. He answered on the second ring. I did not bother with pleasantries. "Thomas," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I have a major problem and I am hiring you right now. I do not just want my house back. I want them financially and legally annihilated." I met Thomas Gallagher the following morning at a discreet diner on the outskirts of the city, far away from my neighborhood and anyone who might recognize me. Thomas was exactly as I remembered him, sharp, meticulously dressed, and exuding a calm, predatory confidence. I slid into the booth across from him, handed over the thick folder of documents I had pulled from the county clerk office, and laid out the entire situation. I watched his eyes scan the pages, darting rapidly across the dense legal text. He did not interrupt me once. He absorbed the details of the $2.5 million commercial loan, the pending sale agreement to Sterling and Vanguard, and the forged signature, accompanied by the notary stamp, dated the very day I was lying incapacitated in the intensive care unit. When he reached the final page, he slowly set the folder down on the Formica table. I expected outrage or perhaps a lecture on the difficulties of proving notary fraud in civil court. Instead, a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. He tapped his index finger against the forged quitclaim deed and let out a low, dark chuckle. He told me that my sister-in-law was certainly ambitious, but she was also incredibly sloppy. In her desperate rush to steal my multi-million-dollar estate and secure a massive cash payout, she had completely overlooked a fundamental principle of property law. She had focused entirely on the primary residential structure and the immediate acreage surrounding it, assuming that the physical house was the only asset of real value. Thomas leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, and informed me that Cynthia had made a massive, arrogant mistake. She had successfully transferred the title for the main residential lot, but she had completely failed to properly research the original plat maps from the county zoning board. Her blinding greed had obscured the finer details of the property boundaries, and in the world of high-stakes real estate litigation, the devil is always in the details. I felt a sudden surge of anticipation, realizing that my own history with this land was about to become my ultimate weapon. She had left a glaring, fatal loophole wide open, a mistake that would completely destroy her. I smiled back at Thomas leaning into the booth as the diner waitress refilled our coffee cups. I explained to him exactly how I had acquired the property over 4 decades ago. Back in the 1980s, long before the surrounding area was developed into expensive residential neighborhoods, I was a young, hungry contractor looking for the perfect place to build Martha her dream home. I found a beautiful, sprawling piece of acreage set far back from the main county highway. But there was a major logistical catch. The land was entirely landlocked by a massive stretch of dense, unusable forest. To gain legal and physical access to the building site, I had to negotiate a separate purchase with a completely different local landowner. I ended up buying the property in 2 distinct, legally separate pieces. I purchased the primary acreage where I eventually built the house, which was designated on the municipal tax maps as Parcel A. Then I bought a long, narrow strip of land that connected Parcel A directly to the main county highway. That secondary strip, designated as Parcel B, served a crucial, irreplaceable function. It was the 500-foot private gravel driveway that provided the only physical access route to the house. But more importantly, because I was a general contractor and knew how to maximize infrastructure, I used Parcel B to run every single essential utility line. I personally excavated a deep trench straight down the center of that long driveway, laying the primary water mains, the heavy-duty electrical conduits, and the sewer connections that linked the isolated house on Parcel A directly to the municipal city grid. Without Parcel B, the beautiful home on Parcel A was effectively an island completely cut off from the outside world. It had no legal access road, no independent power source, and absolutely no running water. Over the years, I had maintained both parcels, meticulously paying the property taxes on time and ensuring the utility trench remained undisturbed. But because the two parcels were purchased at different times from completely different sellers, they retained their separate, independent legal identities in the vast county archives. The two properties were always entirely legally distinct entities. Thomas pulled the forged quitclaim deed back across the table, tapping his pen against the legal description of the transferred property. He pointed out the specific lot numbers listed on the fraudulent document. Cynthia and Bradley had pulled the public tax records for the residential address, saw the primary lot where the house sat, and forged my signature to transfer that specific title to Apex Holdings. They only forged the deed for Parcel A. They had absolutely no idea that the driveway and the utilities were located on a legally separate lot. Cynthia had assumed, like any amateur fraudster looking for a quick, massive payday, that the long driveway and the land beneath it were simply included in the primary residential deed. What she failed to discover was that 10 years ago, on the advice of my estate planner, I had quietly transferred ownership of Parcel B into a completely different blind trust. I was the sole trustee and the absolute only individual with the legal authority to manage or alter the status of that specific piece of land. Cynthia did not steal my entire estate. She only stole the physical structure. She had successfully scammed the bank into issuing a $2.5 million loan against a house that was entirely dependent on a separate piece of property she did not control. I looked at Thomas, the profound realization of our immense structural advantage fully setting in. My sister-in-law was actively finalizing a multi-million-dollar commercial sale to Sterling and Vanguard, promising to deliver a fully functional, highly valuable piece of prime residential real estate. But because she did not own Parcel B, she did not own the driveway. She did not own the water lines. She did not own the electrical connection. She was trying to sell a house that was legally trapped. I controlled the gates, I controlled the water, and I completely controlled the power. The corporate developers were expecting a prime piece of land ready for immediate demolition and luxury construction. Instead, Cynthia was about to hand them a useless, landlocked prison. The poetic beauty of her arrogant mistake was absolute perfection. She had unwittingly built the very trap that was going to completely and utterly destroy her. Thomas did not waste another single second. Right there in the diner booth, he opened his heavy briefcase and drafted an immediate emergency legal revocation. As the sole trustee of Parcel B1, formally and legally severed the implied utility and access easement between the two adjoining properties. Thomas filed the urgent paperwork electronically with the county clerk before our coffee even went cold. The trap was officially set. Cynthia was currently finalizing the sale of a multi-million-dollar property that now legally had absolutely no water, no electricity, and no legal road access whatsoever. If anyone from Sterling and Vanguard tried to cross that private driveway, they would be strictly guilty of criminal trespassing. We had severed her lifeline without her knowing a single thing about it. Thomas packed up his briefcase, ready to initiate the next phase of our aggressive counterattack. He told me to sit tight and wait for the developers to walk blindly into the disaster. But before I let the heavy hammer fall completely, I had one final agonizing piece of family business to resolve. I needed to know the full extent of the betrayal. I needed to test my younger brother Richard one last time. I needed to look him directly in his eyes and determine if he was merely a naive victim of his wife's manipulative greed, or if he was a willing, active co-conspirator in the total theft of my life savings. If he was completely innocent, I would find a way to spare him from the impending legal slaughter. But if he knew about the forgery, I would show him absolutely no mercy. I left the diner, pulled out my mobile phone, and immediately called his personal number. Richard answered on the third ring, his voice tight and overly enthusiastic, masking the same nervous energy I had heard the day before. I did not mention the bank, the assessment, or Cynthia and her new car. I kept my tone light, playing the role of the lonely older brother that looking for some company on a quiet Wednesday morning. I told him the weather was perfect, and the striped bass were practically jumping into the boat down at the inlet. I invited him out on my small aluminum fishing skiff for a few hours. Richard hesitated, stammering something about inventory arriving at his hardware store, but I gently pushed, insisting so that we needed some quality time together, just like the old days. He finally agreed, likely thinking that keeping me close and placated was the safest strategy for their ongoing scam. An hour later, we were pushing away from the wooden docks. The outboard motor hummed a steady rhythm as I steered us past the breakwater and out into the deeper rolling waters of the bay. I drove us a good 2 miles offshore, dropping the heavy iron anchor in a spot where the coastline was nothing but a thin, hazy smudge on the horizon. There were no other boats around us. The water was calm, reflecting the pale morning sun, but the isolation was absolute. We were completely trapped together on a 20-foot piece of floating metal. There was nowhere for him to run, nowhere to hide his reactions, and no one to interrupt us. I killed the engine, and the sudden silence felt incredibly heavy. I handed him a fishing rod and grabbed my own, casting my line out into the dark water. We sat side by side on the aluminum bench seats for a long time, the only sounds being the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and the cry of a distant seagull. I watched Richard closely from the corner of my eye. He looked terrible. His skin was pale, his shoulders were hunched, and his hands gripped his fishing rod so tightly that his knuckles were stark white. I reeled in, my line slowly turned my body to face him, and looked my brother directly in his eyes, searching for any lingering trace of the man I used to know, hoping to find a shred of decency remaining within his heart today. I broke the quiet tension by clearing my throat, letting out a long, deliberate sigh. I told Richard that my recent health scare back in October had really put things into a sharp perspective for me. I explained that lying in that hospital bed made me realize how fragile life truly is and how important it is to make sure your loved ones are properly taken care of when you are gone. I let those words hang in the salt air, watching his Adam's apple bob nervously as he swallowed hard. Then I played the ultimate emotional card. I reached out, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, and told him that I was officially meeting with my attorney later this week to update my last will and testament. I spoke with a soft, affectionate tone, telling him that since Martha and I never had any children of our own, he and Cynthia were my only real family left. I looked him dead in the eyes and lied with absolute precision. I told him that I was going to bequeath the entire $3.2 million estate directly to him and his son Bradley. I said I wanted the house I built to stay in the Caldwell family forever, and that I knew they would honor Martha's memory and take perfect care of the property. The reaction was instantaneous and intensely visceral. The blood completely drained from the face of my brother, leaving him looking like a ghost hovering over the water. A thick layer of cold sweat broke out across his forehead and upper lip. He began to tremble, his entire body shaking so violently that the tip of his fishing rod rattled against the aluminum side of the boat. He looked physically ill, as if he might lean over the railing and be sick into the bay at any given second. The immense weight of his deep guilt was crushing him from the inside out. I was offering him the greatest financial gift of my life, completely unaware that his wife had already forged my signature to steal it out from under me. He sat there paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his betrayal, staring at the man he was currently allowing to be thrown out onto the street. The silence between us stretched out, suffocating and unbearable as he desperately tried to respond to my gesture. Richard suddenly dropped his fishing rod. It clattered loudly against the aluminum deck as he buried his face in his trembling hands. A choked, pathetic sob escaped his throat, followed by a torrent of desperate tears. He wept like a terrified child, his shoulders heaving with every jagged breath. He looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen, and began to frantically spill his dark secrets. He confessed that his hardware store had not been turning a profit for over 3 years, but the business failure was not the real problem. The real problem was his severe hidden gambling addiction. He admitted that he owed $400,000 to a group of very dangerous private lenders who operated completely outside the law. He claimed these men had been heavily threatening him, promising to enact brutal physical violence against him and Cynthia if the massive debt was not fully settled by the end of the month. He was putting on a spectacular performance of profound vulnerability, laying bare his darkest flaws in a desperate bid for sympathy. But as I sat there listening to his pathetic, tear-soaked confession, the cold realization settled over me. He was still lying. He was telling me a fraction of the truth to manipulate my emotions, completely omitting the catastrophic fact that his wife had already solved their financial problems by stealing my $3 million estate. He leaned forward, grabbing my forearm with a vice-like grip, and literally begged me for a cash loan. He pleaded with me to mortgage my house, to take out a line of credit, to save his life, swearing on his own soul that he would pay me back every single penny. It was a masterclass in sociopathic deception. He was sitting across from me, asking me to leverage a house he knew I no longer owned, attempting to squeeze even more cash out of me while the corporate bulldozers were already actively scheduling my impending demolition. He was protecting the felony forgery of his wife while simultaneously trying to bleed me completely dry one last time. He cried and begged, promising to be a better brother, that completely unaware that his calculated omission had just severed the final fraying thread of our family bond forever. I sat motionless and stared directly at his pathetic, tear-stained face, feeling absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated, and freezing disgust. In that exact moment, any lingering trace of empathy or brotherly love I held for Richard completely evaporated, blowing away like sea mist in the cold ocean wind. He was not a helpless victim manipulated by a greedy wife. He was a spineless coward and a willing accomplice to my total financial destruction. I gently pulled my arm out of his desperate grasp. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, offering him a sad, understanding nod. I told him I would seriously think about his request and see what kind of capital I could pull together by the end of the week. Relief flooded his eyes, completely unaware that I was sealing his inevitable doom. I pulled the heavy anchor up from the dark water, restarted the outboard motor, and steered us back toward the shoreline in total silence. I dropped him off at the wooden docks without offering a hug or a goodbye handshake. I watched him hurry toward his truck, a desperate man sprinting blindly toward a federal prison sentence. I drove back to my neighborhood, my mind meticulously reviewing the aggressive legal strategy of Thomas Gallagher. But as I pulled into my long gravel driveway, my foot slammed hard on the brake pedal. Staked deeply into the soft green grass of my front lawn, right next to the oak mailbox I built 30 years ago, was a massive, glossy wooden sign. The bold corporate lettering read Sterling and Vanguard Commercial Developments, and pasted diagonally across the center was a bright red banner declaring temporarily under contract. The sheer, breathtaking audacity was staggering. They were openly claiming victory on my front lawn while I was still living inside the house. The invasion had crossed the physical threshold, but they had no idea they were marching straight into a minefield. I parked my truck next to that glossy wooden sign, leaving the tires resting just inches away from the heavy wooden stakes. I did not pull it out of the ground. I did not kick it over. I simply stared at it, letting the sheer audacity of the corporate developers sink deep into my bones. They were practically measuring the curtains before the execution. I walked up the porch steps, unlocked my front door, and stepped into the quiet sanctuary of my home. If Cynthia and Bradley wanted to play a high-stakes game of commercial real estate, they were about to learn that a seasoned general contractor knows every single dirty trick buried beneath the concrete. I walked straight into my home office and sat down at my desk. I was not just going to block their sale. I was going to financially bury them. I was going to completely salt the earth. I opened my weathered leather Rolodex and flipped through the thick yellowed cards until I found the contact information for an old friend named Michael Vance. Michael and I had worked together on dozens of municipal construction projects back in the 1980s. He was a master excavator back then, but he eventually retired from heavy machinery and took a comfortable government job working as a senior site inspector for the Environmental Protection Agency. I picked up my phone and dialed his direct municipal office line. He answered with his usual gruff, booming voice. We exchanged a few brief pleasantries, catching up on old times before I smoothly pivoted to the real reason for my call. I told Michael that I was finally getting my estate in order for my golden years, and realized I had a lingering piece of unfinished business from the original construction of my house. I needed to formally and officially register a potential environmental hazard on my primary residential plot. I spoke with a calm, measured tone, explaining that I wanted to ensure everything was strictly by the book before I eventually passed the property down to my heirs. Michael chuckled, praising my meticulous attention to detail, and told me to grab a pen. He guided me through the complex federal registration portal, explaining exactly how to officially document the hazard in the unalterable federal public safety database. The heavy wheels of bureaucracy were now rapidly and officially turning. While I had Michael on the line to verify the specific environmental codes, I typed my property information into the government website. I explained the exact nature of my problem. Back in 1985, when I first bought the land and began grading the foundation for Parcel A, the original structure on the property was a dilapidated, long-abandoned farmhouse. That farmhouse had utilized a massive 3,000-gallon underground heating oil tank. When I cleared the site to build my own house, I was young, rushing to finish the project before the winter frost set in and trying to save every single dollar I could. So instead of paying a certified hazmat team to properly excavate, drain, and safely dispose of the rusted iron tank, I took a massive shortcut. I completely filled the tank with construction sand, capped the heavy iron valves, and simply buried it beneath 10 feet of compacted earth, right next to where I eventually poured the concrete footing for my primary living room. It was a common, albeit highly frowned upon, practice among independent builders back in those days. But decades later, the strict environmental laws had changed drastically. I told Michael that over the last few years, I had noticed a faint, unmistakable chemical sheen pooling in the rainwater puddles near that specific side of the house. The thick iron walls of that underground tank had finally corroded, and the residual toxic sludge was actively leaching deep into the surrounding soil. Michael let out a low whistle, telling me that an active hydrocarbon leak of that magnitude was a Tier 1 environmental violation. He warned me that registering this severe hazard would immediately trigger a mandatory state-monitored abatement protocol. The property would be officially red flagged, meaning the surrounding soil would have to be completely excavated, chemically treated, and safely replaced by a licensed hazardous materials team before any new construction could ever be legally permitted on the site. I thanked Michael for the dire warning, but assured him I was fully prepared to accept the consequences of my youthful negligence. I clicked the final submission button on the federal portal, legally locking the severe environmental hazard directly to the primary residential deed. The brilliant, devastating trap was now fully armed and completely hidden deep beneath the physical ground. The beauty of federal environmental law is its absolute, uncompromising lack of nuance. According to the statutes governing toxic soil remediation, the government does not care who originally buried the hazardous material. They do not care about the timeline, the original intent, or the historical context of the pollution. The law firmly states that whoever legally holds the current deed to the contaminated property is the entity strictly and financially liable for the entire comprehensive cleanup process. Because my arrogant sister-in-law had successfully executed her elaborate forgery, she had officially and legally declared herself the rightful, undisputed owner of Parcel A. By transferring my pristine estate into the portfolio of Apex Holdings, she had unwittingly assumed total responsibility for everything buried beneath the manicured topsoil. She had tried to steal my future, but instead she had legally inherited my past mistakes. I sat back in my desk chair and allowed myself a grim, satisfied smile. A complete Tier 1 soil remediation project on a residential lot is an astronomical expense. It requires bringing in heavy excavation machinery, hiring specialized chemical engineers, transporting the contaminated dirt to specialized waste facilities, and conducting months of rigorous groundwater testing. Based on my extensive experience as a general contractor dealing with similar municipal nightmares, I estimated the total abatement bill would easily reach $200,000. That massive invoice was no longer my problem. It now rested squarely on the shoulders of Cynthia and her fraudulent shell company. She was currently driving happily around town in a $90,000 luxury car, completely oblivious to the fact that she was now legally bound to a $200,000 toxic debt. But the environmental liability was only the first half of my financial retaliation. The second half of the trap was tied directly to her own impatience and insatiable greed. She had secured a massive loan and quickly lined up a corporate buyer because she wanted her hands on millions of dollars immediately. She had sold the property to a company that intended to tear it down, and you cannot demolish a house sitting on top of a registered federal environmental hazard. Sterling and Vanguard were meticulous corporate developers, and their lawyers would undoubtedly discover the newly registered red flag the very moment they inevitably ran their mandatory final pre-closing municipal background check on the stolen residential real estate. Just as I finished submitting the environmental hazard form, my computer screen chimed with an incoming email notification. It was a secure message from my litigation attorney, Thomas Gallagher. He had spent the morning pulling the full, unredacted corporate purchase agreement between Apex Holdings and Sterling and Vanguard. I opened the digital attachment and read the highlighted text Thomas had sent over. Cynthia had signed a legally binding, ironclad commercial contract with the developers. In her desperate rush to secure the multi-million-dollar payout she had formally guaranteed to deliver the property completely vacant, legally unencumbered, and absolutely clear of all liens and hazardous materials. The penalty clause was staggering. If she failed to meet those exact conditions by the designated closing date, she would be found in severe breach of contract and would personally owe the developers a $500,000 penalty fee. She was currently selling them a property with no utility access and a toxic waste leak. Her greed was going to bankrupt her. Suddenly, the silence of my home office was shattered by the sharp buzzing of my smartphone resting on the wooden desk. I picked it up and saw a text message notification illuminating the bright glass screen. It was from Cynthia. The message read, "Hey Harry, Richard and I are having the quiet neighborhood professionally fumigated this weekend for termites. You need to pack your bags and leave the house by Friday morning so the crews can work safely. We went ahead and booked you a motel room in town for a few days to make it easy on you." I stared at the glowing screen, marveling at the cold, sociopathic manipulation. The fake eviction trap, cleverly disguised as a helpful family favor, had officially begun. I was completely ready for it. I stared at my smartphone, reading Cynthia's message. The sheer sociopathic brilliance of her lie was almost impressive. A neighborhood fumigation. It was the perfect excuse to force me out of my own home for a few days without triggering any immediate suspicion or alarm. She had manufactured a plausible emergency wrapped in fake familial concern and booked me a cheap motel room to ensure I would leave the premises. I sat at my heavy mahogany desk, the very desk my late wife Martha had bought for me, and I slowly crafted my response. I needed to feed her massive ego. I needed to confirm her absolute belief that I was nothing more than a frail, confused old man who was completely dependent on her gracious charity. I tapped the glass screen with my calloused thumb, carefully typing out my reply. I wrote, "Thank you, Cynthia. My memory is so bad lately, I completely forgot about the neighborhood association mentioning any termites. I appreciate you taking good care of me. I will start packing my overnight bag right now." I hit send and watched the little notification bubble confirm the message had been delivered. I imagined her sitting across the street in her pristine living room reading my text and smiling with cruel satisfaction. She probably thought she had executed the perfect crime. She had successfully stolen my $3 million estate, secured a massive cash loan, finalized a commercial demolition sale, and was now peacefully evicting me without a single drop of resistance. I stood up and walked into my master bedroom. I pulled a small battered canvas duffel bag from the top shelf of my closet and tossed a few simple changes of clothes inside. I packed my toothbrush and worn slippers. I was playing the role of the compliant, weary victim to absolute perfection. I knew she would not just trust my text message. She would want to verify that I was actually leaving. She would want to gloat. And sure enough, less than 20 minutes after I hit send, the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed loudly through the quiet hallway. Cynthia had arrived to supervise my departure. I opened the front door. Cynthia was standing on my porch, dressed in a sharp, expensive-looking cashmere sweater and perfectly tailored slacks. She wore a bright, artificial smile that stretched tightly across her face, masking the predatory greed beneath. She swept past me into the foyer without waiting for an invitation, bringing with her the overwhelming scent of a high-end floral perfume. "Oh, Harry," she cooed, her voice dripping with thick, patronizing sympathy. "I am so glad you are being reasonable about this whole termite situation. The exterminators told us it is highly toxic, and Richard and I just could not bear the thought of you breathing in those harsh chemicals with your fragile heart condition." I simply nodded, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor, allowing my shoulders to slump in a posture of total defeat. "Let me help you get your things together," she offered cheerfully, immediately marching into my living room. I followed her slowly, watching her eyes dart around the space. She was not looking at the home I had built. She was conducting a final visual inventory before the wrecking balls arrived. She walked over to the beautiful hand-carved cherry wood credenza that Martha and I had purchased during an antique auction 30 years ago. Cynthia ran her manicured fingernails along the polished surface, her nose wrinkling slightly in feigned distaste. "You know, Harry," she said casually, not bothering to look at me, "this house is just so cluttered with all these heavy, outdated pieces. While the fumigators are here, I could arrange to have a charity service come by and collect some of this old furniture. We can just donate it to someone who really needs it. It would really open up the space for you." I felt a sharp, violent spike of anger in my chest. She had absolutely no intention of donating my priceless antiques to any charity. She was planning to drag a massive commercial dumpster right onto my front lawn the second I drove away, intending to throw away every single piece of my life to clear the property for her corporate buyers. She was standing in my house, casually discussing the disposal of my most cherished memories, as if she were taking out the weekly trash. I forced my jaw to relax, biting my cheek to keep quiet. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or defend the value of my belongings. I simply maintained my hollow, exhausted expression and shuffled slowly across the living room carpet. I walked past the cherry wood credenza and stopped directly in front of the brick fireplace I had laid by hand so many decades ago. Hanging proudly above the heavy oak mantel was a large, beautifully framed hand-painted portrait of my late wife, Martha. It was commissioned by a local artist for our 20th wedding anniversary, capturing her warm smile and the gentle kindness in her eyes perfectly. I reached up with a trembling hand and gently touched the gilded edge of the heavy wooden frame. I turned to look at Cynthia, making sure my voice sounded suitably pathetic and entirely broken. "Cynthia," I said softly, my voice wavering just enough to sell the performance, "you can do whatever you think is best with the old furniture. I trust your judgment completely. But please, while the chemical workers are in the house this weekend, just promise me you will take good care of this portrait for me. It is the most valuable thing I own." Cynthia stopped pacing and looked at the painting, her fake smile faltering for just a fraction of a second before snapping firmly back into place. "Of course, Harry," she replied smoothly, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "I will make sure nothing happens to Martha. You have my absolute word." I nodded my gratitude, picked up my small canvas duffel bag, and walked slowly out the front door, leaving my treacherous sister-in-law alone inside my home. What Cynthia absolutely failed to realize was that I was not just being sentimental. The night before, after discovering her multi-million-dollar corporate sale, I had meticulously modified the thick wooden frame of Martha portrait. I had used my specialized contracting tools to hollow out a tiny, invisible cavity right along the decorative floral carving at the top of the frame. Tucked securely inside that cavity was a high-definition motion-activated microcamera. The lens was smaller than the head of a pin, perfectly angled to capture a wide, unobstructed view of the entire living room and foyer. It was hardwired into a long-lasting battery pack and connected directly to my cellular data plan. I had left the ultimate silent witness right in the center of the room. I drove my truck down the county highway to the cheap rundown motel Cynthia had booked for my fake eviction weekend. I pulled into the parking lot, checked into my dingy room, and sat down on the stiff mattress. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket, opened an encrypted application, and tapped the screen to access the live video feed broadcasting directly from my living room fireplace. The high-definition image illuminated my phone screen. I watched closely as Cynthia paced back and forth across my hardwood floors, completely unaware she was being documented. She walked to the front window, peering through the blinds to verify my truck was gone. The moment she felt secure, her entire demeanor shifted. The fake sweetness vanished, replaced by a radiant, deeply sinister triumph. She walked to my kitchen counter, retrieved a bottle of expensive champagne she had smuggled inside her designer handbag, and popped the cork with a celebratory bang. I turned the volume up on my phone, listening, as she took a sip directly from the bottle and pulled out her cell phone. She dialed a number, put the phone on speaker, and waited. A man answered, his voice crisp and professional. Cynthia let out a wicked, breathless laugh. "It is done," she announced, pacing triumphantly in front of my hidden camera. "The old fool is completely gone. He bought the fumigation story without a single question. The property is totally vacant. The house is yours tomorrow morning. Send the demolition crews whenever you are ready." I watched her dance a little jig right in the middle of the room I built. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face in the dark motel room. I tapped the screen securely, saving the recorded video file to my cloud server. She had taken the bait perfectly. It was finally time to pull the plug. I did not stay in that dingy motel room for very long. As the sun dipped below the horizon on Thursday evening, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and deep gray, I packed up my small canvas duffel bag and walked back out to my truck. The air had grown bitterly cold, but I barely felt the chill against my skin. The fiery anticipation burning inside my chest kept me perfectly warm. I drove slowly through the darkened streets of the town, navigating the familiar route back toward my neighborhood, but I did not drive all the way up to my house. Instead, I pulled my truck over and parked on the soft shoulder of the county highway, right at the very beginning of the 500-foot gravel driveway. This specific patch of dirt was the exact starting point of Parcel B. It was the crucial strip of land that I had placed into a blind trust a decade ago, the land that Cynthia had completely failed to steal. I stepped out of the truck and walked over to the heavy wrought iron security gate that guarded the entrance to the driveway. I had welded this gate myself many years ago to keep trespassers out, but I usually left it wide open for convenience. Tonight, convenience was entirely off the table. I reached into the heavy canvas tool bag I had brought from my truck and pulled out a massive industrial-grade steel padlock. It was the kind of heavy-duty lock used on commercial construction sites, designed to withstand bolt cutters and angle grinders. I swung the two heavy iron doors of the gate shut, the metal hinges groaning loudly in the quiet night air. I wrapped a thick, hardened steel chain around the center bars, pulled the links as tight as humanly possible, and snapped the massive padlock shut with a loud, satisfying click. I gave the chain a hard, aggressive tug to ensure the mechanism was perfectly secure. The physical barrier was now officially in place. Anyone trying to access the house on Parcel A, whether they were a deceitful family member or a corporate real estate developer, would now find their path completely and legally blocked by a wall of solid iron. The very first layer of my ultimate trap was now fully legally and permanently engaged under the cool, dark night sky. With the main security gate locked down, I turned my attention to the second phase of my operation. I walked away from the road, stepping onto the thick grass, marking the boundary of Parcel B. As a former general contractor, I knew the exact layout of every single utility line because I personally laid them 40 years ago. I marched toward a small concrete utility vault partially hidden by overgrown juniper bushes. This vault was located 50 feet inside my property line, acting as the primary junctions between the municipal grid and the underground pipes leading to the house. I knelt in the damp grass, pulled a heavy iron wrench from my tool bag, and pried the concrete lid off the vault. Inside, nestled deep in the earth, was the massive brass wheel of the primary water main. I fitted the wrench over the brass wheel, gripped the handle with both hands, and pulled with every ounce of strength I had. The old valve groaned in harsh protest, fighting against decades of pressure, but it eventually yielded to my leverage. I turned it clockwise until it stopped completely. The steady rushing sound of municipal water flowing through the thick copper pipes instantly died. The house on Parcel A was now completely severed from the city water supply. There would not be a single drop flowing into the house tonight. I replaced the heavy concrete lid and slowly stood up, brushing the damp dirt from the knees of my denim jeans. Next, I walked over to the tall, green metal electrical transformer box positioned a few yards away. This box controlled the heavy-duty power lines running straight down my gravel driveway. I used a specialized key from my tool bag to unlock the metal panel. Inside was a row of massive industrial-grade electrical breakers. I looked down the long driveway toward the home I built for Martha. Several exterior security lights were glowing warmly against the dark structure. I reached into the metal box, grabbed the thick plastic handles of the primary breakers, and violently pulled them downward. A loud, heavy thunk echoed through the chilly night air. Instantly, the glowing lights illuminating the distant house completely vanished. The stolen property was suddenly plunged into absolute unforgiving, pitch-black darkness. The entire sprawling residential structure was now a cold, dead, empty shell, utterly disconnected from the civilized world forever. I walked back to my truck, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I rolled the window down just enough to let in a thin stream of cold night air, and stared out into the pitch-black void where my illuminated home used to be. The silence was absolute. I sat in the darkness for nearly 2 hours, letting the gravity of my actions settle deeply into my bones. I was completely ready for the fallout. Exactly at 9 o'clock, the serene silence was shattered by the sharp, piercing ringtone of my cellular phone resting in the center console. I glanced down at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed Bradley's name in bright white letters. I cleared my throat, making sure my voice sounded appropriately weak and deeply confused, and pressed the green button to accept the incoming call. Before I could even mutter a simple hello, Bradley's voice exploded through the speaker. He was in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic, his usual slick broker persona entirely stripped away. "Uncle Harry," he practically screamed into the phone, his breathing ragged and shallow. "Are you awake? I need you to tell me what is going on with the utility accounts at the house." My mother went over to do a final perimeter check after the fumigators left, and the entire property is completely dead. The power and water are entirely out at the house. "Did you forget to pay the municipal utility bill this month?" I held the phone away from my ear for a moment, savoring the absolute terror radiating through his frantic voice. I brought the receiver back to my mouth and stammered out a pathetic, trembling response, claiming that my memory had been so foggy lately that I must have forgotten to mail the physical check. Bradley let out a harsh, furious groan of frustration, completely dropping his fake nephew act. He yelled that this was an absolute catastrophic disaster. He screamed that the corporate commercial developers from Sterling and Vanguard were scheduled to arrive at dawn for their mandatory final physical walkthrough before they authorized the massive wire transfer. He told me that if the house was not fully functional and ready, the entire multi-million-dollar commercial deal would be completely ruined. He was literally hyperventilating through the digital connection. I simply apologized again. He hung up instantly in pure rage. I pulled the phone away from my ear and listened to the harsh, disconnected dial tone. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I held down the power button on the side of the device, watching the screen power down, and turn completely black. I was officially unreachable. They were going to spend the entire night spiraling into absolute blind panic, frantically trying to contact utility companies that were legally forbidden from taking their orders and realizing that their massive payday was slipping directly through their greedy fingers. I opened the door of my truck and stepped back out into the freezing night air. I walked around to the tailgate and pulled out a heavy canvas folding lawn chair that I always kept stored in the back for fishing trips. I grabbed a thick wool blanket, a heavy crystal tumbler, and a sealed bottle of my favorite aged scotch. I carried everything over to the absolute edge of the gravel driveway, positioning the chair squarely on the invisible exact legal property line that permanently divided Parcel A from Parcel B. I unfolded the canvas chair, draped the thick wool blanket over my heavy shoulders, and sat down. I uncorked the glass bottle, the sharp sound echoing loudly in the quiet night, and poured a generous measure of the amber liquid into my crystal glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the fiery heat burn a path straight down my chest. I looked across the vast, invisible barrier at the massive, dark silhouette of the house I had built for Martha. The steel trap was now fully legally and irrevocably sprung. There was absolutely nothing left for me to do tonight, but to sit right here and wait for the morning sun to finally rise on their total destruction. The first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon, casting long, cold shadows across the gravel entrance of Parcel B. I sat perfectly still in my lawn chair, the wool blanket wrapped tight around my shoulders, watching the headlights of a distant convoy approach through the morning mist. 3 vehicles pulled up to the locked wrought iron gate. At the front was Cynthia's gleaming black Mercedes, followed by a sleek corporate SUV, and bringing up the rear was the white and blue cruiser of the county sheriff's department. The engines idled, their exhaust plumes swirling in the freezing air. I watched as the doors opened simultaneously. Cynthia stepped out looking immaculate in a tailored wool coat, holding a steaming latte in one hand and her designer handbag in the other. Bradley followed, checking his watch with an air of nervous importance, his eyes darting toward the dark house in the distance. 2 men in expensive Italian suits emerged from the middle SUV carrying leather briefcases and looking around with the cold, impatient gaze of men who measured time in thousands of dollars per hour. Finally, Deputy Collins stepped out of his cruiser. He was a man I had known for years, a regular at the local diner, usually quick with a joke. But this morning his face was set in a professional grim mask. He gripped a stack of official legal papers in his left hand. They had arrived exactly on schedule for their final victory march. They looked at the heavy steel chain and the industrial padlock I had installed on the gate, then looked at me sitting there in the dark with my glass of scotch. The corporate developers looked confused, but Cynthia simply smirked, leaning against the hood of her car. She didn't even look at the lock. She looked at me like I was a stubborn stain she was finally about to scrub away. The silence of the morning was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of cooling engines and the crunch of gravel as the deputy began to walk toward the iron bars that separated my trust land from the stolen estate. Cynthia took a slow, theatrical sip of her latte, her eyes shining with a radiant, deeply sinister triumph. She let out a short, sharp laugh that echoed off the trees, a sound devoid of any family warmth. She didn't even bother to hide the malice anymore. She yelled out over the gate, her voice cutting through the quiet morning like a jagged blade. She said, "Hurry up, old man. The sheriff is finally here with the official eviction papers. You had your chance to leave quietly, but you just had to be difficult. Well, playtime is over. This house and this land are officially ours now." Bradley stood beside her, nodding in agreement, though he couldn't quite meet my eyes. He was already looking past me, gesturing toward the house for the benefit of the 2 corporate developers. He told the executives that the lock on the gate was just a final desperate act of a senile relative, and that the deputy would have it removed in seconds. The men from Sterling and Vanguard looked annoyed, one of them checking his phone and muttering about their tight closing schedule. They didn't care about the family drama. They just wanted the property vacant so they could signal the wire transfer and start the demolition. Cynthia looked at me with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. She told me I was nothing but a clueless old fossil who didn't understand how the modern world worked. She said I was a nuisance that was finally being disposed of. She turned to Deputy Collins and pointed a manicured finger at the padlock, demanding that he do his job and remove the trespasser from her corporate property. She was so convinced of her own brilliance, so certain that her forged documents made her untouchable, that she was practically vibrating with arrogance. She expected me to break down, to plead for another hour to pack my things, or to go into a senile rage. But I just sat there, took a slow sip of my scotch, and waited for the law to come to me. Deputy Collins reached the gate, his expression pained as he looked at me. He had a job to do, and he couldn't ignore a signed court order. He told me he was sorry it had come to this, Harry, but he had a writ of possession issued to Apex Holdings, LLC. He reached through the wrought iron bars and handed me the heavy stack of stapled papers. I took them with a steady hand, set my scotch glass on the gravel, and began to read. I didn't hurry. I turned to page 2, where the original quitclaim deed was referenced as the foundation for the eviction. I looked up at the deputy, my voice calm and resonant, carrying clearly to the group standing by the cars. I said, "Deputy Collins, I want you to look very closely at the notary signature date on page 2 of this filing. It is dated October 14th. I reached into the side pocket of my lawn chair and pulled out a thick blue medical folder embossed with the seal of St. Jude's Hospital. I opened it and held up the primary admission sheet, which was stamped and verified by the chief of medicine. I told him to read the clinical notes. On October 14th, the very day this deed was supposedly signed in front of a notary, I was in a medically induced coma in the cardiac intensive care unit. I was hooked up to a life support system and heavily sedated. I looked the deputy straight in the eye and said, "You are currently holding a forged federal document designed to facilitate a multi-million-dollar wire fraud. I am not the one trespassing this morning, deputy. You are being used to execute a felony." The color drained from Deputy Collins's face so fast, he looked like he was going to collapse. He snatched the medical folder from my hand, his eyes scanning the dates and the physician's signatures with frantic intensity. He looked at the hospital stamp, then back at the legal writ, and then at the hospital records again. He realized in a single terrifying heartbeat that he had been brought here to use the power of the state to enforce a criminal act. He took a slow, deliberate step back from the gate, his hand moving instinctively toward the radio on his shoulder. He turned his head and glared at Cynthia with an expression of pure, cold fury. Across the street, the latte slipped from Cynthia's trembling hand, the ceramic cup shattering on the asphalt and splashing brown liquid all over her expensive shoes. Her mouth fell open, her breath hitching as the blood rushed from her head. The arrogant, triumphant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of sheer, paralyzing horror as she realized her perfect timeline had just collided with an immovable truth. Bradley took a step back, his face turning a sickly shade of green, looking like he wanted to bolt for the woods. The two corporate developers froze, their professional masks cracking, as they realized they were standing in the middle of a federal crime scene. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. But I wasn't done yet. I stood up from my chair, letting the wool blanket fall to the ground. I turned my attention away from the crumbling sister-in-law and focused my gaze directly on the two executives from Sterling and Vanguard. I had one more bomb to drop, and this one was going to bury their entire investment. I stood up from my lawn chair and let the heavy wool blanket slide off my shoulders, pooling on the gravel like the remains of a shed skin. I looked past the deputy, focusing my gaze on the two corporate executives from Sterling and Vanguard. They were clutching their leather briefcases as if the expensive leather could protect them from the truth. I allowed a slow, cold smile to spread across my face. I told them that I understood they were here to close on a multi-million-dollar development project, but that they had made a catastrophic error in their due diligence. I explained that while my sister-in-law may have forged a deed for Parcel A, which contained the physical house, she had absolutely no legal claim to Parcel B. I pointed to the very ground they were standing on the 500-foot private driveway. I told them that I was the sole trustee of this specific strip of land, along with the utility trench buried beneath it. Since I had officially severed the easement, they were currently standing on private property without a valid permit. I informed them that they had just purchased a $3 million unbuildable island. The house they intended to bulldoze was now a landlocked shell with no legal road access, no water, and no electricity. I would never grant them an easement, and I would fight any attempt at eminent domain until I was in the grave. But the lack of access was the least of their worries. I watched their eyes widen as I dropped the final hammer. I told them that I had formally registered a major environmental hazard with the federal government yesterday morning. There was a 3,000-gallon leaking oil tank buried deep beneath the foundation of the house. By taking the deed, their company was now strictly and financially liable for a $200,000 toxic soil remediation process. I told them to enjoy their new poisoned and landlocked acquisition. The reaction from the developers was instantaneous and absolute. Their professional, cold demeanors shattered into 1,000 pieces of pure, unadulterated fury. The lead executive turned on Cynthia and Bradley with a face so red it looked like he was having a stroke. He began to scream, his voice echoing through the quiet morning air, accusing them of criminal misrepresentation and gross negligence. He yelled that they had guaranteed a property clear of all liens, hazards, and encumbrances. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a copy of their signed contract, and shook it in Cynthia's face. He screamed that his firm was immediately enacting the $500,000 breach of contract penalty clause and that they would be suing Apex Holdings and Cynthia personally for every single cent of their wasted investment. Bradley tried to stammer out a defense, his hands shaking as he held his iPad, but the second executive stepped forward and cut him off with a single sharp snarl. He told Bradley that he was going to report his fraudulent conduct to the state licensing board before the sun set today. He promised my nephew that he would never work in real estate again, not even as a lowly assistant. Bradley looked like he was going to be physically ill right there on the asphalt. He realized in that agonizing second that his career, his reputation, and his future were all being incinerated in front of his eyes. Cynthia was backed up against her Mercedes, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, unable to find a single lie to save herself. The corporate vultures she had invited to pick my bones clean had now turned their razor-sharp talons on her. Her greed had not just failed, it had triggered a financial landslide that was about to bury her entire family. Just as the screaming reached a fever pitch, two unmarked black SUVs turned the corner and pulled up behind the deputy's cruiser. The doors swung open with military precision, and my attorney, Thomas Gallagher, stepped out. He was followed by two men in dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the FBI printed across the back. Thomas had spent the last 48 hours coordinating with federal prosecutors presenting the undeniable evidence of wire fraud and identity theft. Because Cynthia had used a forged document to secure a $2.5 million commercial loan that crossed state banking lines, she had moved her crimes out of local jurisdiction and into the realm of federal felonies. One of the agents approached Cynthia, his face a mask of stone. He did not ask questions. He simply recited her rights in a cold, monotone voice as he forced her arms behind her back. I watched in silence as the heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around her manicured wrists. Cynthia began to wail a high-pitched, desperate sound that carried across the neighborhood. She screamed for Richard, begging her husband to do something to save her, to tell them it was all a mistake. But Richard just stood on the sidewalk across the street, his face wet with tears, his shoulders slumped in total pathetic defeat. He looked at his wife being pressed against the hood of her $90,000 Mercedes, then looked at me and then looked away in shame. He realized that his life was over, his house was gone, and his gambling debts would now be the least of his problems. The FBI agents loaded a sobbing Cynthia into the back of the SUV, while the corporate developers continued to shout at Bradley about the impending lawsuits. Justice was not just being served, it was being delivered with the weight of a freight train. The aftermath was a swift and brutal sequence of legal and financial dominoes falling one after another. In the weeks that followed, the commercial bank moved with predatory speed to protect their interests. They immediately froze every account associated with Cynthia and Apex Holdings, and because the initial $2.5 million loan had been obtained through blatant felony fraud, they moved to seize all of Cynthia and Richard's personal assets to recoup the loss. Their own home, the gleaming black Mercedes, and even Richard's hardware store were all liquidated through the court system. They were left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs and a mountain of legal fees. Thomas Gallagher worked tirelessly in civil court, and with the FBI's criminal investigation providing the heavy lifting, the forged quitclaim deed was formally declared null and void. I reclaimed my clean, unencumbered deed within a month, wiping the fraudulent lien off my property forever. Bradley lost his broker's license permanently and was barred from ever working in the financial sector again. He disappeared from the state, unable to face the community he had tried to exploit. But for Cynthia, the reckoning was far more permanent. Because of the magnitude of the fraud and the clear evidence of her calculated manipulation while I was in a hospital bed, the federal judge showed her zero leniency. She was sentenced to 10 years in a federal correctional facility. As for Richard, he avoided prison time by cooperating with the authorities against the illegal lenders he owed money to, but he was left a broken man living in a tiny rented room and working a minimum wage job to survive. My family had tried to erase my existence, but in the end, they were the ones who vanished. I was still standing in the house I built the owner of every brick, every board, and every memory. I stood up from my lawn chair and let the heavy wool blanket slide off my shoulders, pooling on the gravel like the remains of a shed skin. I looked past the deputy, focusing my gaze on the two corporate executives from Sterling and Vanguard. They were clutching their leather briefcases, as if the expensive leather could protect them from the truth. I allowed a slow, cold smile to spread across my face. I told them that I understood they were here to close on a multi-million-dollar development project, but that they had made a catastrophic error in their due diligence. I explained that while my sister-in-law may have forged a deed for Parcel A, which contained the physical house, she had absolutely no legal claim to Parcel B. I pointed to the very ground they were standing, on the 500-foot private driveway. I told them that I was the sole trustee of this specific strip of land, along with the utility trench buried beneath it. Since I had officially severed the easement, they were currently standing on private property without a valid permit. I informed them that they had just purchased a $3 million unbuildable island. The house they intended to bulldoze was now a landlocked shell, with no legal road access, no water, and no electricity. I would never grant them an easement, and I would fight any attempt at eminent domain until I was in the grave. But the lack of access was the least of their worries. I watched their eyes widen as I dropped the final hammer. I told them that I had formally registered a major environmental hazard with the federal government yesterday morning. There was a 3,000-gallon leaking oil tank buried deep beneath the foundation of the house. By taking the deed, their company was now strictly and financially liable for a $200,000 toxic soil remediation process. I told them to enjoy their new poisoned and landlocked acquisition. The reaction from the developers was instantaneous and absolute. Their professional, cold demeanors shattered into 1,000 pieces of pure, unadulterated fury. The lead executive turned on Cynthia and Bradley with a face so red it looked like he was having a stroke. He began to scream, his voice echoing through the quiet morning air, accusing them of criminal misrepresentation and gross negligence. He yelled that they had guaranteed a property clear of all liens, hazards, and encumbrances. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a copy of their signed contract, and shook it in Cynthia's face. He screamed that his firm was immediately enacting the $500,000 breach of contract penalty clause, and that they would be suing Apex Holdings and Cynthia personally for every single cent of their wasted investment. Bradley tried to stammer out a defense, his hands shaking as he held his iPad, but the second executive stepped forward and cut him off with a single sharp snarl. He told Bradley that he was going to report his fraudulent conduct to the state licensing board before the sun set today. He promised my nephew that he would never work in real estate again, not even as a lowly assistant. Bradley looked like he was going to be physically ill right there on the asphalt. He realized in that agonizing second that his career, his reputation, and his future were all being incinerated in front of his eyes. Cynthia was backed up against her Mercedes, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, unable to find a single lie to save herself. The corporate vultures she had invited to pick my bones clean had now turned their razor-sharp talons on her. Her greed had not just failed, it had triggered a financial landslide that was about to bury her entire family. Cynthia's wailing grew more erratic as the reality of the federal agents sank in her voice, cracking into a shrill, unrecognizable pitch that echoed off the quiet suburban facades. It was a sound of pure, naked desperation, the kind of noise a person makes when they realize the golden pedestal they built out of lies has finally crumbled into dust. I watched as she struggled against the handcuffs, her expensive cashmere sweater snagging on the cold metal of the Mercedes hood, a perfect metaphor for her entire life being caught in the gears of a system she thought she had mastered. The FBI agents remained impassive, their movements clinical and efficient, treating her not as a relative or a respected neighbor, but as a flight-risk felon caught in the act of a multi-million-dollar wire fraud. Bradley, meanwhile, was experiencing a different kind of death. He wasn't screaming, he was hollow. He stood near the gate, his hands still clutching the iPad he had used to package my life for sale, his eyes darting from the angry developers to the grim face of Deputy Collins. He looked at me for a split second, and for the first time in his life I saw a flicker of genuine, unvarnished fear, not just of prison, but of the realization that his clueless old uncle had been 10 steps ahead of him since the very first day. He tried to speak, perhaps to offer one last slick negotiation, or a pathetic apology, but the words died in his throat when the lead executive from Sterling and Vanguard took a step toward him, pointing a trembling finger and promising to pursue every legal avenue to see him barred from the industry for life. Richard's reaction was the most painful to witness. He wasn't just losing his wife to the law, he was losing the illusion that he could ever escape the hole he had dug for himself. He watched the bank's representative, who had quietly arrived in a separate vehicle, begin the process of affixing property of the bank stickers to the Mercedes and taking notes for the impending seizure of their own home across the street. Richard realized in that moment that the safety net of my stolen equity was gone, and the dangerous private lenders he owed $400,000 to would not be moved by his tears. He looked like a man who had suddenly aged 20 years in 20 minutes, his spine curving under the weight of a defeat he had helped create through his own silence. Just as the black SUVs began to pull away, carrying Cynthia toward a processing center and a future of steel bars and fluorescent lights, the corporate developers remained on the driveway, arguing loudly into their phones about toxic assets and legal recourse. They looked at my house, the island they had mistakenly bought, with a mixture of revulsion and disbelief. I simply picked up my crystal tumbler, drained the last drop of scotch, and gave them a polite, silent nod. The sun was fully up now, illuminating the truth for everyone to see. The neighborhood was waking up, doors opening, and neighbors peering out at the chaos, witnessing the exact moment the Caldwell family's dark secret was dragged into the light. I turned my back on the wreckage of their greed and walked toward my front porch, feeling the solid, honest weight of the oak stairs beneath my boots. Stairs that would never be bulldozed, and a home that was finally, truly back in the hands of the man who built it. In the weeks that follow, the bank seizes all of Cynthia and Richard's personal assets to recoup the fraudulent loan. Their house, the Mercedes, everything is gone. Harry easily reclaims his clean deed in civil court. Cynthia faces 10 years in federal prison.